an attempt to change our state constitution. That's a big deal. So it would become the highest law of the land. And I think that's the first piece, is to understand sort of where it sits in the stature of um, our law. But then really what it's all about is to give an unfettered right to abortion to anyone, provided by any type of provider at any point in the pregnancy. And so it's sort of, imagine the widest, most pro-abortion policy you could possibly come up with. And that's essentially what they've put into this bill.
Welcome to Caring for Both, a curbside consult series by the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, or APLOG. On this podcast, we bring on experts to provide insights to support you as medical professionals in your life-affirming practice and career. I'm your host for today, Rebecca Weaver, Director of Advocacy and Policy for APLOG Action. As some of you may or may not know, Virginia's recent election was a huge disappointment for the pro-life movement. This election, Abigail Spanberger, a staunchly pro-abortion candidate, became the governor-elect of Virginia. She supports a radical abortion proposal that endangers women and kills preborn children. It's called the Virginia Right to Reproductive Freedom Act, but the title is of course deceiving and doesn't tell the real story. If passed in 2026, this bill would legalize abortion for up to 9 months, remove vital safeguards, and enshrine abortion as a constitutional right in the state. Joining us to discuss this amendment is Victoria Cobb, president of the Family Foundation, the largest and oldest pro-family advocacy organization in Virginia. She also oversees the work of their legal arm, the Founding Freedoms Law Center, and is the president of the Family Foundation Action, a 501c4 that protects families and promotes responsible citizenship by giving Virginians the tools they need to hold their elected officials accountable, including educating and mobilizing voters in key elections. Victoria, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Well, let's just jump right in. I think we have a lot to talk about on this topic. So let's just start with, how significant really is the recent Virginia election outcome for the pro-life movement, and what does it signal for future legislative battles?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that there's a lot of disappointment across Virginia in the fact that not only did we elect pro-abortion candidates at the statewide levels, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, but also our House of Delegates. And so what this really means is that the pro-abortion mindset is rampant now in our government, and it's going to be very challenging to bring them, I would say, facts and understanding that would help them make better decisions than they will naturally make. Because unfortunately, the people that were put in office in some not insignificant part by the pro-abortion lobby. When you have Planned Parenthood and others that pour into your campaigns and do your door knocking and all the things, these people tend to be beholden to them. So we've got our work cut out for us, and I think significantly because it's both chambers and the governor.
Yeah. So can you explain to us what the Virginia Right to Reproductive Freedom Act actually proposes, and why is this title misleading?
Yeah, this is a really devastating piece of legislation because, first of all, it's not just a bill. It's an attempt to change our state constitution. That's a big deal. So it would become the highest law of the land, and I think that's the first piece, is to understand sort of where it sits in the stature of um, our law. But then, really, what it's all about is to give an unfettered right to abortion to anyone, provided by any type of provider at any point in the pregnancy. And so it's sort of, imagine the widest, most pro-abortion policy you could possibly come up with. And that's essentially what they've put into this bill. There's just basically no parameters around the practice of abortion. And really, even more than that, there's not even really parameters around the practice of medicine within the context of abortion, meaning, um, you know, this doesn't even define that surgical abortions will be provided by a doctor. This doesn't even define that it actually shields doctors that uh, practice medicine in other states illegally. So imagine a situation where you've got a state like Texas or a state like Louisiana or someplace that has done a good job protecting human life. What we would do is this constitutional provision would say if a medical provider in our state wants to, let's say, ship chemical abortions into another state, we're not going to have a problem with that. We're not going to allow another governor to come after that individual, and their illegal practice of medicine is not going to be frowned upon with their medical license here. So I mean, it's the worst case scenario, and we're pretty devastated that this is what we're battling up against.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned some of these in your answer just then, but are there any others you want to mention about the specific safeguards that would be removed if this amendment passes? And then just kind of broader stroke, what are the implications for women's health and parental rights if this amendment passes?
Yeah, it's really important to understand this would almost inevitably immediately overturn our parental consent for abortion, which is a super important safety parameter for our young girls. That a parent would be involved in that conversation, that a parent would be guiding them, that a parent is ultimately going to have to deal with the ramifications if something goes wrong in this child's abortion. And so to box them out by constitutional provision is really devastating because, again, the right that they're offering in this goes to any individual, and it says any individual, not any adult, any individual has this right. And then it goes kind of further than that. It says, and by the way, anybody that gets interferes with that is problematic. And so by saying that, they're essentially being pretty clear that the parent would be, I would call it interference in their words, that we would be stepping in between the child and her right to the abortion. So that's one big safety parameter, I would argue, and a parental rights issue. But more than that, it's also just any kind of safety standards that we've seen around the practice of abortion. So I mentioned the provider issue, but it's not just the provider, facility issues. In Virginia, we've had long, very difficult battles over just saying, look, if we're going to provide an outpatient surgery, let's treat it like a place that provides an outpatient surgery. If that's the reality of what's going on in these buildings, why do we not have life resuscitation equipment? Why would we in any way not have doctors that don't have admitting privileges so that if something goes wrong, they're immediately moved to a hospital that's nearby? Those are the kind of things that we've been battling in Virginia, and this constitutional amendment pretty much shuts down that conversation and makes it so that we don't see any path to get those things back on the books. Because again, even though you and I would say there's no way that should count as interfering with somebody's right. I mean, we would say the right's still there. We're just going to make it safe at the very least with those kind of laws. But the other side has made it pretty clear in court battles that really any single thing that would in any way make an abortion facility spend an extra dollar or do an extra thing that would be, I would argue, in the safety of the woman, they would say is in fact cumbersome on the industry. And therefore, we would expect that this constitutional amendment wouldn't allow for any of those kind of parameters. And then we think about the safety things that we've had in the past in Virginia that aren't in place right now, but we certainly would love to get back. And that's things like a 24-hour waiting period. That deals with coercion. I think medical professionals understand this, that not every decision is actually her choice. A lot of women actually feel tremendous pressure, and that can even go to very serious coercion instances. And when you don't have even that 24-hour waiting period, there's just a lot of factors that really take place that aren't helpful and healthy in a decision that's that significant. And then we had at one point in our law that the woman had a right to see her own ultrasound. That this is routinely done to make sure that they know that there's a pregnancy, that the pregnancy is not an ectopic pregnancy. I mean, these are pretty standard things when we're considering going in and doing surgery. And yet, in this particular case, that law we think would be almost impossible. Also, that she has a right to her own medical files. I mean, it's funny that we think about that. In almost every other case, I can go and request all my medical files. I can see my lab results. I can, as a patient, I can interface with these things. And yet, if you really create an unfettered right to abortion and claim that all of that stuff is just interference in her right, then the industry can block out really what I would call, patient ownership or consent, like real understanding of what's about to happen. So those are all sort of things that are at stake. And then, of course, just the idea that we're going to allow elective abortion up until the moment of birth, right? So in Virginia right now, at least there's this parameter that says, look, if there's three doctors that say there's a real reason. Now, some of us would say there's not actually a medical reason to have an abortion that late, but if there's an actual medical reason and there's three doctors, that's what our law says now. Then a late trimester abortion can take place. It should be in a hospital. In this case, with this constitutional provision, it's just a single provider has to sign off on it. Well, guess what? That provider is the abortionist who makes the money from the surgery, right? So this is a disastrous policy. So I would argue that's a safety protection that comes off. It's just the idea that there's some concurrence of the medical community that this is worth doing that surgery. And of course, we would say it's never worth taking a human life. But so that's a whole bunch of safety things that just go straight out the window. And yes, some of them are not in our law at the moment, but they have been in the past and they should be. And the ability to move forward and try to, you know, allow for some women's safety around abortion would be obsolete.
And I think something that's important to note about these amendments, as we've seen in other states, and that would be true here, and you essentially were saying it there at the end, is because this is a constitutional amendment, if it passes, you can't go back necessarily and pass bills to change that, right? Because that would be quote unquote interfering.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a constitutional amendment in Virginia, just in case folks aren't aware, I mean, most folks, every state's different, right? So in Virginia, it takes 2 years. That's how it's supposed to work. We'll talk about the timeline because I think we do need to sort of talk about the weird situation we find ourselves. But the way it was intended is that you're supposed to pass it through the General Assembly one time, have an election so that the electorate can react to what you've done, right? If they don't like that they've brought this forward, the electorate picks a new General Assembly and then they can reject it. But if they accept the same language the second time, it rolls to our ballot, which is kind of, we're in the middle of that process. But a law, you just run it through one time. So the reality is, constitutional provisions stay in the Constitution for decades and decades. It's just not a quick process. It doesn't get undone easily. And so, yeah, they're really trying to shut down all debate, shut down all avenues for even what we would consider the most reasonable, common sense parameters around such a serious decision and such a serious medical practice.
Right, right. All the things you're saying just highlight this is bad for women and bad for the medical profession too. But I think you brought up the timeline, and that is so important and it's so unique in Virginia. And so talk to us about that. All I know there's a lot going on around these timeline considerations about the amendment. So tell us what we need to know about that.
Yeah, we're on a wild political ride here in Virginia. So the way it is supposed to work is that we have just had an election after they affirmed it the first time. And so the way it's supposed to work is we roll back into the General Assembly, which in Virginia meets January, February, March. The group of people would have to affirm it for the second time, and then it would go to our November 2026 ballot. However, that's how it's supposed to work. What we had happen is unprecedented. So I'm describing something that doesn't fall in the norm, isn't really a practice that is, I would argue, legal. But we had the Democrat-controlled legislature called themselves back into session a week before our election date, and they did this in order to start a new constitutional issue. They wanted to basically, you've heard all around the country, people are talking about redistricting so that they get more congressmen in next year. And as I said, it's a 2 year process, right? So you can't get them in next year if you didn't already start it last January. Well, they decided that they could run in, pass it the first time, a redistricting provision to change. Our Constitution right now says districts are created by a nonpartisan commission, and that doesn't work for them. That won't get them enough of their members. Our congressional delegation is 6 Democrats right now, 5 Republicans out of 11 congressmen and women, and they think that they could redraw a map to be 10 Democrats, 1 Republican, or 9-2, and so they rushed in, passed a constitutional change the first time to try to undo our nonpartisan commission to be able to accomplish this. Then they're considering the election a week later as the intervening election that happens by law. Now, here's the tricky part. People had already voted before they ever did this because we have early voting for 45 to 60 days ahead of the election. So it's kind of a wild idea that they think it's a legitimate intervening election if hundreds of thousands of people didn't get to vote against you for doing that, right? So this is just an unprecedented thing. Now, we're not a partisan. This isn't a partisan discussion. So
Right.
it would be irrelevant, except that what they're going to do is, so now they've had their step one on the partisan thing. They've had their election. They're going to come back in January. They're going to pass it the second time. And then here's where it gets real tricky on our timeline. They can hold a special election as early as maybe very end of April, early May, so that people pause that nonpartisan redistricting in order for them to elect some be able to change the districts fast enough for the 2026 election. Why this impacts us? So that was like a lot of what in the world. But the reason it impacts us is the amendment that we're talking about would probably be fast forwarded and possibly put on that same ballot in a special election instead of the November election. We hear right now that they are actually out in the field with polling to figure out if people are more or less likely to go their direction if they put it on a special election ballot in April or they keep it on the November election. So they're really trying to work the numbers to their favor. And so we actually literally don't know, but it's possible that this could be 6 months in advance of when we thought it would be. So it could be a very fast forwarded project. And we're pretty devastated that the rules could be twisted this way. There is legal action against them for trying to basically rush this other thing. So who knows? This is not how it's intended to be. This is not what the founders intended when they drafted how you change the Virginia Constitution. They were guys that were all about slow and methodical change. That's why we don't have petition signs. In California, you just get enough signatures, you throw something on the ballot. Not Virginia. We had guys like Thomas Jefferson and those guys, and they didn't want things to move quickly. They didn't want the populace to have a passion and throw something into the Constitution based on a very whim type situation. And so seeing a 2 year process be truncated into, we'll call it 8 months, is a bit shocking to all of us. And we are hoping, for the sake of what was intended, that the courts would shut that down and that our amendment would definitely go back to November. But that's our situation. So we will deal with this either in end of April, early May, or November. We don't know.
Okay. And do you have any idea like when that will be known, or is it's very just up in the air and we'll just see as the courts decide and the legislature convenes and all of that?
So we should see their intention of what they want to do with the abortion amendment when legislative session starts in January, February, because the date should go in the bill. Like this is going to go on the whatever. They have a draft bill right now. It doesn't have a date. Interestingly enough, there's another constitutional provision that they're trying to change that is not something that we're focused on, but it's a felony rights thing. And they have, if you look in that one, they have the date listed as it'll be on the November 2026. But the abortion one, it's a blank slate right now. So that's the first time that we could know for sure. And then, of course, the litigation is the other part. We have a law center. Litigation is on its own timeline. It is so hard to tell when you really will have an answer as to whether people who are challenging this will be successful. So I am sorry to say I don't have the clarity that I wish we all had on this. So I'd say buckle up. We are certainly going to work against this as if it is coming as soon as April.
Well, and I think that highlights why we're even having this conversation now, because if you think, next November, the general elections in November 2026 seem really far away. They're really not, but they seem really far away, like a year nearly. And so that gives context to why we're having this discussion even now. So thank you for that. That is very complicated, and thank you for breaking it down. No, thank you for breaking it down for us. So just to kind of wrap up, tell us specifically about what the Family Foundation is doing to educate and mobilize Virginians ahead of whether it's late April or November 2026 vote. What are you guys doing? And also let us know, where can our listeners find you?
Yeah, so we're doing a ton of different things. I mean, the first thing that we've been doing for about a year is a lot of research on just making sure we know what is the best way to talk to the public about this. And I will tell you guys in particular, as medical professionals, your opinion matters probably the most in what they hear about this. So we just really are passionate about really helping people understand the safety risks, and that the medical community certainly is not united that this is a great idea. Honestly, the irony is that they have full control over the legislature. They could have an amendment that has the right to abortion, but also has safety in it. There's no reason they couldn't. And so it's just stunning to us that the public would let this go when they could get it, even from a pro-choice perspective, they could get it right, if that makes sense. They could at least provide the safety for the woman. So it's almost like they're reckless with two lives instead of just one, and it's stunning. So we've done a lot of work to just learn how it is that the average person who might not be as in the know as we all are, that might not be extreme on one side or the other, but kind of somebody that's just sort of dead in the middle. We've got to convince them to vote against this. And some of them will think, oh, I want abortion, which is just horrifying. But, I think that's a good thing. We got to convince them, like, even if you think this is okay to have the right, the safety issue is a big, big deal. And that's going to be a big role of the medical community. So we've been doing a lot of research, trying to figure all that out. Because, of course, if it were me, I would just go out and say, look, it's an unborn child. We don't want to do that. But that's not the message that everybody needs to hear. So we've been learning a lot about that. And then we've been spending a lot of energy, particularly on the faith community. That's an area where we think there's just a lot of alignment on the life issue is with the church. And so we've been going out to churches and faith communities across Virginia, talking principally to the leaders, principally to clergy, pastors, and other faith leaders, so that they understand this and they can pass it down to their congregation in a way that their congregation would receive it really well. So it's been a big education lift. So far, we know of we're almost headed towards 900 one-on-one or in a small group presentations to faith leaders. So if all of those guys and gals actually go back to their congregations and share, that's a big percentage of folks that are starting to learn what this is, what's coming. So we're doing a big workup on the preemptive side. Now that we're moving towards this thing is really about to move into the public, it's going to be a lot of things that look like a standard campaign, commercials, get out the vote. If it's a special election, I will tell you, it's going to be about motivating our people to care enough to actually come out to the ballot, which is a little different than November. Most people kind of come out for regular elections. If your congressman's on the ballot, you might be coming out anyway. That's not true of an April election, and so we're going to have a lot of work to get people to care enough to go take the effort and actually go vote. And so that's going to be a big piece. Is just sort of the one-on-one. We do a lot of direct texting to target universes. We're an organization that has a very political side that does door knocking. So we will literally be targeting individuals. Now that's on an April timeline, that gets really hard. So an April timeline looks much more like a phone, television kind of trying to reach the voters. But we're going to need doctors actually to be a big part of what's in those commercials, what is in that messaging, op-eds, all those kinds of things will be probably standard form. Now, the tricky part is always, and this is every state, it's going to be about the money. And that's the hard thing. You can have the best message in the world, but it has to actually reach people. And so that's where what the Family Foundation does, what other groups do. We're working with, literally tens of, probably about 75 organizations is what I think it is. I haven't really counted, of different groups that are also doing work in this election with us. So there's a lot of people. So it's really going to depend on kind of, can these groups, all of us collectively, raise enough funds to actually hit the airways well? And as you know, the pro-life side, that's a real challenge. And unfortunately, because some amendments have lost in other states, it's an even bigger challenge. Because, there are folks who think, oh, how are we ever going to win? Because it is a pretty daunting task. We know that Florida was able to beat theirs back. We know that Nebraska was able to pull it out, South Dakota. So there are ways to do this. We believe that we can, but it's really, really important that everybody that has an audience in Virginia, a friend in Virginia, a family member, that we're reaching the people that are in our network, whatever our network can be defined as. So that's what you'll see us doing. And the way that folks can find us is familyfoundation.org. You can look, we've got socials too. If you're on Instagram, Family Foundation Action, which is our little bit more political side, is really what our handles are on the social media, Facebook as well, Twitter, all the things. And we do a lot of issues, so you'll hear other things besides just this one issue, but this will be the focus. This will be the focus.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Victoria, for all of that and for being with us today and sharing all of this information with us that's so important, just for all of us to know, but especially Virginians. So thank you for that and for what you guys are doing.
Absolutely. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. And thank you to our listeners for joining us today. If you like this episode, be sure to give us a like and a subscribe on YouTube, or if you're listening on a podcast app, give us a 5-star review. Help us to continue to clarify in the midst of confusion. We can only do this with your dues and with your support, so please consider a donation to AppLog or AppLog Action, and we'll see you on our next episode.